My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 29 years old, and for the past 6 years, I've been quietly building a multi-million-dollar tech empire from my modest apartment in Austin, Texas. By day, I'm the founder and CEO of Nexus Analytics, a data security company that protects some of the biggest corporations in America from cyber threats. But to my father, David, I'm still the disappointing daughter who dropped out of his precious pre-med program and threw away my future on what he calls computer games. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The phone call that changed everything came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night in March. I was in my home office, 3 monitors glowing in the darkness, debugging code for a client presentation that could secure us a $20 million contract with a Fortune 500 company. The harsh ring of my phone cut through the silence like a blade. When I saw his name on the caller ID, my stomach clenched. David Martinez never called unless someone was dead or he needed something. His voice was slurred with alcohol and thick with the familiar venom of disappointment. "Rebecca, your life is falling apart and I can't watch it anymore. Your mother is worried sick about you living alone in that dump, wasting your brain on computers while real opportunities pass you by. It's time you came home and fixed this mess you've made of yourself." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to tear down what little confidence he thought I had left. If you've ever had a parent tear you down just when you were building yourself up, let me know where you're watching from. The irony was suffocating. As he ranted about my supposed failures, I was literally staring at an email from TechCrunch requesting an interview about my company's revolutionary encryption software. Behind me, awards from industry conferences sat on shelves he'd never seen. In my desk drawer lay contracts worth more money than he'd made in his entire career as a small-town insurance agent. But to him, I was still the 23-year-old who'd walked away from medical school, disappointing him so deeply that he'd barely spoken to me since. I let him finish his drunken monologue without saying a word. Years of therapy had taught me that engaging with his attacks only fed the fire. When the silence stretched long enough that even he felt uncomfortable, he delivered his final blow. "Your cousin Jessica just got accepted to Johns Hopkins residency program. At least one of you girls turned out right. Maybe you should call her and ask how she did it." The comparison stung exactly as he had intended. Jessica, the golden child, who'd followed the path I'd abandoned, who sent him graduation photos and hospital badge pictures that he proudly displayed on his refrigerator. After he hung up, I sat in the blue glow of my monitors, feeling like I was 23 again, small and ashamed, and questioning every choice I'd made. The sophisticated CEO who'd given presentations to boards of directors vanished, replaced by the scared girl who'd once cried herself to sleep, wondering if disappointing her father meant she was fundamentally broken. But then, my phone buzzed with a notification that snapped me back to reality. It was my head of security, Marcus, texting from our London office about a potential breach attempt we'd successfully blocked. The reminder of who I actually was, of what I'd built, slowly began to push back the darkness my father had summoned with his words. The next morning brought clarity with the sunrise. I made coffee in my kitchen, looking out at the Austin skyline where several buildings now housed companies that depended on my software to keep their data safe. I'd started Nexus Analytics in this very apartment, working 18-hour days, living on ramen noodles and determination. The first year, I'd made exactly $467. The second year, $12,000. By year 3, I'd hired my first employee. Now we employed 43 people across 3 countries, and our yearly revenue had just topped $8 million. My father's call had been a wake-up call, but not in the way he had intended. For 6 years, I'd been hiding my success, downplaying my achievements, and allowing him to maintain his narrative that I was a failure. I'd been so afraid of his judgment, so conditioned to seek his approval, that I'd made myself small in his presence. But sitting there with my coffee, reading congratulatory emails from clients and partners, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't ashamed of who I'd become. I was proud of it. And it was time he knew exactly who his daughter really was. The decision to reveal the truth didn't come from a place of anger, though there was plenty of that simmering beneath the surface. It came from something deeper, something that had been building for years. I was tired of hiding, tired of letting him believe his version of my story, tired of family gatherings where I sat quietly while he bragged about everyone else's accomplishments and pointedly avoided mentioning mine. The little girl who once desperately craved his approval was gone, replaced by a woman who'd learned that the only validation that mattered was her own.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The million small moments when I'd chosen his comfort over my own truth, protecting him from the reality that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. But as I sat surrounded by the documentation of 6 years of relentless work and remarkable success, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger at him for his blindness, not resentment for the years of criticism, but a profound sadness for everything we'd both lost. He'd missed watching his daughter build something remarkable because he'd been too invested in his own narrow definition of success to see what was right in front of him. And I'd missed having a father who celebrated my victories because I'd been too afraid to share them. The phone rang again just after noon. This time, it wasn't my father. It was my mother, Alina, calling with the nervous energy of someone delivering a message she'd been instructed to give. Her voice was gentle but strained as she told me that David was worried about me, that he'd been up all night thinking about our conversation. She asked if I might consider coming home for the weekend, maybe talking to him about making some changes in my life. The subtext was clear. He'd sent her to finish what he'd started, to apply the soft pressure of maternal concern where his harsh judgment had failed. I listened to her careful words, hearing the love beneath them, but also the familiar pattern that had shaped my entire childhood. He would attack, I would retreat, and she would smooth things over by suggesting I try harder to meet his expectations. But this time, I had something different in mind. This time, I wasn't going to retreat at all. I told my mother I would think about visiting, but we both knew I was buying time. After hanging up, I realized I needed perspective from someone who understood the stakes. I called the one person who'd witnessed my transformation from struggling dropout to successful entrepreneur, my business partner and closest friend, Zoe Chen. We'd met during my darkest period, when I was waiting tables at a tech conference, serving overpriced coffee to the very people I dreamed of becoming. Zoe picked up on the first ring, her voice sharp with concern. She could hear the strain in my greeting before I'd even explained what happened. Within an hour, she was at my apartment with Thai takeout and the no-nonsense attitude that had helped us navigate every crisis our company had faced. I told her about the phone call, about the years of hiding, about the suffocating weight of being perpetually disappointing in my father's eyes, despite building something he couldn't even comprehend. She listened without interruption, her dark eyes growing more intense with each detail. When I finished, she set down her chopsticks and looked at me with the same expression she wore during board meetings when someone questioned our capabilities. "Rebecca, you've been living like a refugee in your own life. You built a fortress and then decided to hide in the basement instead of standing on the ramparts." Her words cut deep because they were true. I'd spent so much energy protecting myself from his judgment that I'd forgotten to actually live in the success I'd created. That night, Zoe helped me craft a plan that felt both terrifying and liberating. Instead of a confrontation or a dramatic revelation, we would orchestrate a situation where the truth would reveal itself naturally. She suggested I invite my parents to Austin under the pretense of wanting to show them my life, but without revealing the scope of what that actually meant. Let them discover who their daughter had become organically, through experience rather than explanation. The idea felt like stepping onto a tightrope without a net, but something about it resonated with the strategic thinking that had built my company. I wasn't trying to prove anything or seek revenge.
I was simply ready to stop hiding. The next morning, I called my mother back and extended the invitation, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. I told her I'd been thinking about what she and David had said, and maybe it was time for them to see my life in Austin firsthand. Elena's relief was palpable through the phone. She immediately began making plans, suggesting dates, asking about hotels. I told her not to worry about accommodations, that I would handle everything. She assumed I meant booking them a modest room somewhere, not realizing I was planning to put them up in the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons, courtesy of my corporate account. The conversation felt surreal, like I was speaking in code about a life she couldn't imagine I was living. 2 weeks later, I stood in the arrivals area of Austin Bergstrom International Airport, watching passengers emerge from the gate where my parents' flight had landed. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a tailored blazer that suggested success without screaming wealth, understated jewelry that hinted at prosperity without ostentation. I wanted to look professional but approachable, successful but not intimidating. The careful balance felt like preparing for a crucial client presentation, except the stakes were infinitely more personal. When I saw them walking toward me, David slightly ahead as always, Elena trailing behind with their carry-on bags, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. But this time, instead of shrinking into myself, I stood straighter. I'd done nothing wrong. I'd built something extraordinary. The shame belonged to someone else now. David's greeting was typically restrained, a brief hug and a quick assessment of my appearance. He made a comment about the airport being bigger than he'd expected, the subtle implication being that Austin was still just a smaller version of somewhere more important. Elena was warmer, genuinely happy to see me, though I could sense her nervousness about the weekend ahead. She'd clearly been tasked with monitoring the situation, ready to smooth over any potential conflicts between her husband and daughter. The first surprise came when we reached the parking garage. Instead of the beat-up Honda Civic David expected his struggling daughter to drive, I led them to my Tesla Model S, sleek and silent in the fluorescent lighting. His eyebrows raised slightly, but he said nothing, probably assuming I'd borrowed it or was leasing something beyond my means. Elena commented on how nice it was, her voice carrying that careful tone parents use when they're trying to be supportive but don't quite understand what they're supporting. The drive to their hotel was filled with small talk and pointed questions. David asked about my job in that tone he used when discussing something he considered beneath serious consideration.
I kept my answers vague, mentioning that I worked in technology and did consulting for various companies. Technically true, though describing yourself as a consultant when you own the company felt like the understatement of the century. When we pulled up to the Four Seasons, Elena's sharp intake of breath was audible from the back seat. This wasn't the modest accommodation she'd expected for their weekend visit. David's expression shifted to confusion as I handed the valet my keys and led them toward the gleaming lobby with its soaring ceilings and contemporary art installations. The concierge greeted me by name, asking if Mr. and Mrs. Martinez had enjoyed their flight and confirming their suite was ready. Sweet. The word hung in the air like a revelation. Elena's eyes widened as she looked around the lobby, taking in the obvious luxury, the staff members who clearly knew me, the casual way I navigated an environment that cost more per night than most people made in a week. David remained silent, but I could see him recalculating, trying to fit this new information into his existing narrative about my life. Their room was on the 23rd floor, with panoramic views of downtown Austin and Lady Bird Lake. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the city's impressive skyline, the Colorado River winding through it like a silver ribbon. Elena went straight to the windows, pressing her hands against the glass like a child at an aquarium. David stood in the center of the room, slowly turning in a circle, taking inventory of amenities that probably cost more than his monthly salary. I explained that I'd made dinner reservations for 7 at Uchi, one of Austin's most celebrated restaurants, and that I'd pick them up at 6:30. The name meant nothing to them, but the reverence in my voice suggested this wasn't a casual chain restaurant. I left them to settle in, promising to give them a proper tour of the city the following day.
As the elevator doors closed, I caught a glimpse of David standing by those massive windows, staring out at a city he was beginning to realize his daughter navigated with surprising authority. Back in my apartment, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction mixed with anxiety. Phase 1 was complete. They were beginning to question their assumptions about my circumstances, but they hadn't yet grasped the full scope of what they were discovering. Tomorrow would bring bigger revelations, but tonight was just about letting them sit with their confusion, their growing awareness that the narrative they'd constructed about my life might be fundamentally flawed. I spent the afternoon preparing for what felt like the most important presentation of my career. Not because of money or contracts, but because I was finally ready to show my parents exactly who their daughter had become. The scared young woman who'd left medical school 6 years ago had been replaced by someone they'd never bothered to meet. Tomorrow, they would have no choice but to acknowledge her existence. The evening at Uchi was a masterclass in subtle revelation. I had deliberately chosen a restaurant where I was known, where the sommelier would recommend wine pairings, and the chef might send over additional courses to complement our meal. But I hadn't prepared my parents for the experience of watching their supposedly struggling daughter navigate a world they'd never imagined she could access, let alone belong to. The maitre d' greeted me warmly, calling me Miss Martinez and confirming our reservation at the chef's table. Elena and David exchanged glances as we were led to prime seats overlooking the open kitchen where James Beard award-winning chefs prepared each dish with precision and artistry. The menu prices made David wince, but before he could say anything about the expense, I was already ordering wine and discussing preparations with our server like someone completely comfortable in this environment. Watching my parents that evening was like observing anthropologists encountering an unfamiliar culture. They were careful with their words, uncertain of the etiquette, clearly wondering how their daughter had gained entry to this world and what it was costing her. When the bill came, I handled it smoothly with a black Amex card that David definitely noticed. He'd worked in insurance long enough to recognize the trappings of real financial success versus someone living beyond their means on credit. The drive back to their hotel was quieter than the earlier trip from the airport. Elena asked careful questions about the restaurant, about how I'd discovered it, about whether I ate there often. David remained mostly silent, but I could sense him processing, reevaluating, beginning to construct new questions about a daughter who was rapidly becoming a stranger to him. Standing in the hotel lobby saying goodnight, I felt the shift in energy between us. The dynamic that had defined our relationship for 29 years was cracking, revealing something underneath that none of us quite knew how to navigate. Tomorrow would complete the transformation, but tonight was about letting them absorb the cognitive dissonance of discovering that everything they thought they knew about my life had been wrong. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that Austin spring days are famous for. I had barely slept, my mind cycling through the day's planned revelations like a chess player anticipating every possible move. At 9 sharp, I pulled up to the Four Seasons, finding my parents waiting in the lobby with the slightly overwhelmed expression of tourists who'd spent the night in luxury they hadn't expected to experience. Elena looked refreshed, but bewildered, commenting on the quality of the hotel's complimentary breakfast and the view from their suite. David seemed more guarded, his insurance agent mind clearly working to calculate costs and draw conclusions about my financial situation. He dressed in his best casual clothes, the kind of outfit he wore to church or important family events, suggesting he'd begun to understand that today might require a different level of presentation than he had initially anticipated. Our first stop was deliberately chosen to ease them into the reality of my world. I drove them to South by Southwest Interactive, where the festival was in full swing, the streets teeming with tech entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and industry innovators from around the globe. The energy was infectious. Thousands of people gathered to celebrate and showcase the kind of technological innovation that had become my professional language. As we walked through the crowded streets, I began pointing out companies and technologies, speaking with the fluency of someone who lived and breathed this ecosystem daily.
When we passed a startup's outdoor demonstration, I casually mentioned their Series A funding round and their challenges with user acquisition. David's eyebrows raised at my detailed knowledge of their business model and financial situation. This wasn't the casual interest of a hobbyist, but the informed perspective of someone deeply embedded in this industry. The moment of truth came when we arrived at Nexus Analytics, where Nexus had a prominent booth in the cybersecurity pavilion. I'd coordinated with Marcus to ensure our display was running at peak performance, showcasing our latest encryption protocols and the impressive client testimonials that lined our presentation boards. As we approached, I could see the exact moment when David noticed the company logo matched the name embroidered discreetly on my jacket. Marcus spotted us from across the pavilion and approached with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to representing our company at major industry events.
Tall, articulate, and impeccably professional, he embodied the caliber of talent that Nexus Analytics attracted. His greeting was warm but respectful, addressing me as CEO Martinez in front of my parents, who stood frozen in a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. Elena's hand flew to her mouth as Marcus began explaining our latest client acquisition to a group of interested prospects, detailing a contract worth $12 million that would expand our European operations significantly. The numbers weren't abstract figures from a business magazine. They were real contracts, real money, real success happening in real time in front of her eyes. David remained silent, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, calculation, and something approaching awe. The booth was busy with serious inquiries from Fortune 500 companies, government contractors, and international corporations seeking our cybersecurity solutions. I moved through these conversations naturally, discussing technical specifications, implementation timelines, and pricing structures with the ease of someone who'd built this company from the ground up. My parents watched me transform before their eyes from the daughter they thought they knew into a business leader operating at the highest levels of a multi-billion-dollar industry. When a reporter from TechCrunch approached for a scheduled interview about our recent expansion into artificial intelligence, I introduced my parents as family members visiting from New Mexico. The reporter's questions were sophisticated, focusing on market positioning, competitive advantages, and our strategic vision for the next 5 years. As I answered, providing detailed insights into industry trends and our company's role in shaping the future of data security, I watched David's face undergo a fundamental transformation. The interview lasted 20 minutes. During which time my parents witnessed me discussing partnerships with Microsoft, our collaboration with federal agencies, and our projected revenue growth of 200% over the next 18 months. These weren't aspirational goals or wishful thinking. They were documented realities, backed by signed contracts and established relationships with some of the most powerful organizations in the world. After the reporter left, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Elena was staring at the booth's wall of industry awards, reading citations for innovation, leadership, and technological advancement. David's attention was fixed on a framed letter from the Department of Homeland Security, thanking Nexus Analytics for our role in preventing a major cybersecurity breach that could have compromised critical national infrastructure. Marcus, sensing the family dynamics at play, excused himself to handle other booth visitors, but not before mentioning that my keynote address at tomorrow's Cybersecurity Summit had attracted registration from over 3,000 industry professionals. The casual way he delivered this information, as if speaking engagements of this magnitude were routine parts of my schedule, seemed to hit my parents with fresh waves of recognition about who their daughter had become. We left the convention center in relative silence, my parents processing what they'd witnessed, while I grappled with my own complex emotions. Revealing the truth felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like finally removing armor I'd worn for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand unprotected. The drive to our next destination gave them time to formulate questions, though neither seemed quite ready to voice the magnitude of their confusion.
Our next stop was the Nexus Analytics headquarters, a sleek building in Austin's tech corridor that I'd purchased 2 years earlier when we'd outgrown our original office space. The contemporary architecture and prime location spoke to success in a language that even someone outside the tech industry could understand. As we pulled into my reserved parking space, marked with a small placard reading CEO, Elena finally broke her silence. "Rebecca, I don't understand what's happening here." Her voice carried a mixture of wonder and something approaching fear, as if she was worried that acknowledging this new reality might somehow make it disappear. David remained quiet, but I could see him taking inventory of every detail, from the building's impressive facade to the security systems that granted me access with a simple keycard scan. The office tour was carefully orchestrated to demonstrate the scope and sophistication of what we'd built. 43 employees working in collaborative spaces designed to foster innovation, multiple conference rooms equipped with state-of-the-art technology for client presentations and international video conferences, a research and development lab where our engineers developed cutting-edge security protocols that protected billions of dollars in digital assets. My assistant, Jennifer, greeted us in the lobby with the professional warmth she showed to important visitors, confirming my afternoon schedule and mentioning that the CEO of a major telecommunications company had called to discuss a potential partnership. The casual mention of these high-level business relationships, delivered as routine administrative updates, continued to reshape my parents' understanding of my professional reality. In my corner office, with its panoramic views of the Austin skyline, surrounded by industry awards, framed patents, and photographs from speaking engagements at major tech conferences, David finally found his voice. His question came out as barely more than a whisper, loaded with years of assumptions that were crumbling in real time. "How long has this been going on?" The simple question contained multitudes. How long had I been successful? How long had I been hiding it? How long had he been wrong about everything? I settled into my desk chair, the same where I had taken his devastating phone call just weeks earlier, and began to explain. 6 years of building something from nothing, of turning a rejected medical school dropout into a recognized leader in one of the world's most competitive industries. I walked them through the timeline from my first client contract worth $3,000 to our current status as a preferred vendor for major corporations and government agencies. I showed them financial statements, client testimonials, and industry recognition that documented a trajectory of sustained growth and increasing influence. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of their long-held beliefs about my life and choices. Elena cried quietly as she read a letter from a small business owner in Colorado, thanking our company for protecting his family's livelihood from a ransomware attack that could have destroyed everything he had worked for. The human impact of our work, the real people whose lives were better because of the company I'd built, seemed to affect her more deeply than the impressive financial figures or industry accolades. David's reaction was more complex, a mixture of pride, confusion, and what looked uncomfortably like grief. He was mourning the daughter he thought he'd known, while simultaneously trying to process the successful woman sitting across from him. The cognitive dissonance was written across his features as he struggled to reconcile 6 years of disappointment with the undeniable evidence of extraordinary achievement. As the afternoon wore on, the full scope of the revelation settled over them. I wasn't just successful, I was remarkably successful. I hadn't just survived leaving medical school, I'd thrived in ways that exceeded anything they had imagined possible. The phone call that started this entire sequence, his drunken assessment that my life was falling apart, now seemed not just wrong, but absurdly, almost comically wrong. The final moment of truth came when Jennifer knocked on my office door, reminding me that the car service had arrived to take me to the airport for my flight to San Francisco, where I was scheduled to deliver the opening keynote at a major cybersecurity conference the following morning. The casual way she mentioned the private jet, the waiting audience of industry leaders, and the topics I'd be addressing drove home the ultimate reality. Their daughter had become someone they never bothered to know.
Jennifer looked surprised when I asked her to reschedule the keynote, but she handled it with the professional efficiency that made her invaluable to our operations. Some conversations couldn't wait, and this one had already been postponed for 6 years. The three of us needed to sit in this room with the truth and figure out what came next. After Jennifer left to coordinate the changes to my schedule, I closed my office door and returned to my desk. My parents sat across from me like clients in a meeting they hadn't expected to attend, unsure of the protocols and struggling to process the power dynamics that had shifted so dramatically from their last understanding of our relationship. David kept looking around the room, taking inventory of evidence that contradicted everything he'd believed about his daughter's life. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question came from Elena, but David's expression suggested he was wondering the same thing. It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure because the answer required me to articulate years of hurt, fear, and self-protection that I'd never put into words before. I chose my words carefully, trying to explain without inflicting unnecessary pain, while still being honest about the emotional landscape that had led to my silence. Because every time I tried to share anything about my work, about my success, it was dismissed or minimized or turned into evidence that I was wasting my potential. I looked directly at David as I spoke, watching him process memories of conversations through this new lens. "When I got my first major client contract, I called to tell you. You asked when I was going to get a real job. When I hired my first employee, you said I was playing house with other people's money." The specific examples landed like physical blows. David's face contorted with recognition and what appeared to be genuine remorse as he recalled conversations that had seemed insignificant to him, but had been devastating to me. Each dismissive comment, each comparison to Jessica's medical school achievements, each suggestion that I was wasting my education had built a wall between us that I'd eventually stopped trying to climb. I stopped sharing because it hurt too much to have my victories treated like failures, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. It was easier to let you think I was struggling than to keep hoping you might be proud of what I was actually building. The truth of that statement surprised me with its clarity. I'd been protecting myself from disappointment by managing their expectations downward, creating a false narrative that felt safer than risking their continued disapproval. Alina was crying openly now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she grappled with the realization that her daughter had achieved extraordinary success while feeling unable to share it with her own family. "We should have known," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We should have asked better questions, looked deeper, tried to understand instead of assuming." Her words carried the weight of parental guilt mixed with genuine grief for the relationship we could have had if fear and pride hadn't stood in the way. David's response was more complex, his face cycling through emotions as he processed not just what he'd missed, but what his reactions had cost all of us. "I thought I was protecting you," he said finally, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I thought if I pushed you hard enough, you'd go back to medicine, to something secure and respectable. I never imagined you could build something like this." He gestured around the office, encompassing not just the physical space, but everything it represented. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had as a family. For the first time, David listened without immediately offering corrections or alternative suggestions. He asked genuine questions about the company, about the challenges I'd faced, about the industry I'd chosen to make my career. His insurance background actually gave him a framework for understanding risk management and business development, and I watched him begin to appreciate the complexity and sophistication of what Nexus Analytics had become. Elena wanted to know about the personal cost of building the company, about the relationships I'd sacrificed, the social life I'd forgone, the isolation I'd endured during the early years when every dollar had to be reinvested and every decision carried enormous weight. Her questions came from a place of maternal concern, trying to understand not just what I'd accomplished, but what it had cost me to accomplish it. As the afternoon stretched into evening, I found myself sharing stories I'd never told anyone except Zoe. The nights I'd worked until dawn solving technical problems that threatened major client contracts. The months I'd lived on savings while pursuing patents that might never generate revenue.
The moments of doubt when competitors with better funding and more established reputations had seemed poised to crush my small company before it could gain traction. But I also shared the victories they'd missed. The day we'd signed our first $1 million contract, and I'd celebrated alone in my apartment because I had no one to call who would understand what it meant. The morning I'd been featured on the cover of Cybersecurity Today magazine, an honor that represented recognition from the most respected voices in my industry. The evening I'd received a handwritten thank you note from a small business owner whose entire livelihood we'd saved from a sophisticated cyber attack. David's transformation throughout this conversation was remarkable to witness. The dismissive father who'd called me at 2 a.m. to lecture me about my failing life was being replaced by someone trying to comprehend the daughter who'd been hidden from him by his own preconceptions. He asked technical questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity rather than skeptical interrogation. He wanted to understand not just what I did, but why it mattered, how it helped people, what impact it had beyond the financial success. The most powerful moment came when I showed them our client testimonial wall, where we displayed letters and emails from organizations whose critical operations we'd protected, a children's hospital whose patient records we'd secured from ransomware, a municipal water system whose control networks we'd defended from foreign hackers, a small nonprofit whose donation database we'd recovered after a devastating breach. These weren't abstract business achievements, they were real-world impacts that demonstrated the meaningful nature of our work. Elena read each testimonial carefully, her expression growing amazed with each story of crisis averted, disaster prevented, and livelihoods protected. "You're saving people," she said finally, looking at me with something approaching awe. "All this technology, all these complicated systems, but you're actually saving people." The recognition seemed to help her understand that my career wasn't just financially successful, it was purposeful in ways that connected to her values about helping others and making a meaningful contribution to the world. As evening approached, we found ourselves in territory none of us had navigated before. The old family dynamic, built on David's authority and my deference, had been completely dismantled by the revelation of my success and independence. We were 3 adults trying to figure out how to relate to each other based on who we actually were, rather than who we had assumed we were. The conversation eventually moved from my office to a nearby restaurant, where we continued talking over dinner with an openness that felt both natural and miraculous.
David apologized more than once, not with the perfunctory words of someone going through motions, but with the deep regret of someone who understood that his judgments had been wrong and his actions had been harmful. Elena talked about her own feelings of loss, realizing how much of my adult life she'd missed because of assumptions and poor communication. But the evening wasn't just about recriminations and apologies. It was also about discovery, about learning who we each were beyond the roles we'd been playing for so long. David shared his own fears about financial security, his working-class background that had made him skeptical of anything that seemed too risky or unconventional. Elena talked about her pride in both her daughters, but also her confusion about how to support children whose careers she didn't understand. By the time we said goodnight, something fundamental had shifted between us. The relationship built on his disappointment and my defensiveness had cracked open, revealing the possibility of connection based on mutual respect and genuine understanding. It wasn't a complete transformation. Relationships don't change overnight, but it was a beginning that none of us had expected when this weekend began. Walking back to my apartment that night, I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized by the emotional intensity of the day. The secret I'd been carrying for 6 years was finally out, and the sky hadn't fallen. Instead, something more complex and ultimately more hopeful had emerged from the wreckage of our old patterns. The daughter who'd been hiding was finally ready to be known, and the parents who'd been blind were finally ready to see. The weeks following my parents' visit settled into something I could only describe as cautious rebuilding. David called me 3 times in the first 10 days after their return to New Mexico, not with criticism or unsolicited advice, but with genuine questions about cybersecurity issues he'd read about in the news. He'd started following tech industry publications, trying to understand the world I inhabited, asking about developments at companies I'd mentioned during our conversations. The transformation wasn't complete, old habits died hard, but the effort was unmistakable and deeply appreciated.
Elena had thrown herself into learning about my industry with the enthusiasm she'd once reserved for Jessica's medical achievements. She'd created a Google alert for my name and Nexus Analytics, forwarding me articles about cybersecurity trends with notes like, "I don't understand all of this, but it sounds important and I'm proud of you." Her attempts to bridge the knowledge gap between us felt like small gifts, acknowledgments of the distance that had existed, and genuine efforts to close it. The real test came 6 weeks later when I received an invitation that would have been impossible to navigate under our old family dynamic. The National Cybersecurity Alliance was honoring me with their Innovator of the Year award at a black tie gala in Washington, D.C. The ceremony would be attended by Fortune 500 CEOs, government officials, and media representatives from major technology publications. It was exactly the kind of recognition that should have been shared with family. But historically, I would have attended alone rather than risk their discomfort or dismissive comments about an industry they didn't understand. This time, I called them both. The conversation felt different from any we'd ever had, charged with possibility rather than the defensive tension that had characterized our interactions for so long. I explained the significance of the award, the caliber of the other recipients, and the platform it would provide for discussing the important work our industry was doing to protect critical infrastructure. When I asked if they'd like to attend as my guests, the silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Elena spoke first, her voice thick with emotion. "You want us there? After everything? After all the times we didn't understand or support what you were doing, you still want us there?" The vulnerability in her question reminded me that rebuilding trust required courage from both sides, that they were also taking risks by entering my world so publicly, by potentially being judged for their past failures to recognize my achievements. David's response came more slowly, but with a gravity that told me he understood the significance of the invitation. "I would be honored to be there, Rebecca. I know I have a lot to learn, but I want to understand your world better. I want to be the kind of father who celebrates his daughter's success instead of questioning it." His words carried the weight of genuine commitment to change, not just empty promises made in the immediate aftermath of revelation. The 2 weeks leading up to the gala became an intensive crash course in preparing my parents for an environment unlike anything they'd experienced. I arranged for Elena to work with a personal shopper in Albuquerque to find appropriate attire for the formal event, while David researched the backgrounds of other award recipients so he could engage in informed conversations about the industry. Their dedication to showing up prepared and appropriate demonstrated a level of respect for my world that I'd never expected to receive. The morning of the gala, I met them at their hotel in downtown Washington. Elena looked elegant in a navy blue evening dress that suggested sophistication without trying too hard to compete with the tech industry wives, who would likely be wearing designer gowns worth more than most people's cars. David had chosen a classic black tuxedo that fit him well, and for the first time in my memory, he looked comfortable in formal attire, as if he belonged in environments that required such presentation. The pre-reception cocktail hour was my first opportunity to introduce my parents to colleagues, clients, and industry leaders who had only known me as an individual professional rather than someone with family connections. The conversations were revelatory for all of us, as my parents heard detailed discussions of projects I'd led, problems I'd solved, and innovations I'd developed from people whose respect and admiration for my work was evident in every interaction. Marcus was there with his wife, and I watched my parents observe the easy professional camaraderie between us, the mutual respect that characterized our working relationship. When he introduced them to other Nexus Analytics employees who had flown in for the event, they heard first-hand accounts of my leadership style, my technical expertise, and my commitment to creating a company culture that valued both innovation and integrity. The most powerful moment came during a conversation with Dr. Sarah Chen, the Chief Technology Officer of a major financial services company and one of the most respected voices in cybersecurity. She pulled me aside specifically to tell my parents how their daughter had personally prevented a breach that could have compromised the financial data of millions of customers. Her description of the technical brilliance and strategic thinking required to identify and neutralize the threat painted a picture of professional competence that even someone outside the industry could understand and appreciate. When we were called to dinner, I found myself seated at the head table with the other award recipients, while my parents were positioned at a table with other family members and guests. From my vantage point, I could see them throughout the evening, engaged in animated conversations with the spouses and families of other honorees. Elena was clearly enjoying herself, laughing at stories and asking questions with genuine interest. David looked more serious, but engaged, the expression of someone concentrating on understanding new concepts and making connections. The award presentation itself was thrilling and surreal. Standing at the podium in front of 800 industry professionals, government officials, and media representatives from major technology publications, I felt the weight of recognition for work that had consumed the better part of a decade. But when I looked out at the audience and saw my parents watching with expressions of unmistakable pride and wonder, the moment became something more profound than professional validation. My acceptance speech had been carefully crafted to acknowledge the collaborative nature of cybersecurity work, while also highlighting the specific innovations that had earned the recognition. I talked about the responsibility that came with protecting critical infrastructure, the evolving nature of digital threats, and the importance of continued investment in defensive technologies. But I also took a moment to acknowledge the personal support that had made my career possible, looking directly at my parents as I spoke about the importance of family understanding and encouragement in sustaining the long hours and intense dedication required for this level of achievement.
The standing ovation that followed felt like vindication, not just for me, but for the path I'd chosen despite the disapproval and misunderstanding I'd faced along the way. When I returned to my seat, the congratulations from other honorees and industry leaders created a chorus of validation that my parents could witness firsthand. They were seeing not just my individual success, but my integration into a community of respected professionals who valued my contributions and recognized my expertise. The after-party provided additional opportunities for my parents to engage with my professional world in a more relaxed setting. I introduced them to journalists who had written about our company, venture capitalists who had considered investing in our expansion, and competitors who had become collaborative colleagues on industry-wide security initiatives. Each conversation added another layer to their understanding of the professional ecosystem I inhabited and my position within it. Perhaps the most meaningful interaction came when David found himself in conversation with another award recipient's father, a retired engineer who had initially struggled to understand his son's career in artificial intelligence. The two men bonded over their shared experience of learning to appreciate children who had chosen paths outside their areas of expertise. And I overheard David speaking with genuine pride about my achievements and his regret about not recognizing them sooner. The flight back to Austin the next morning provided quiet time for reflection and processing. My parents were clearly still absorbing everything they'd experienced, from the scale of the event to the caliber of the people who had spoken about my work with such respect and admiration. Elena kept pulling out the program from the gala, reading and rereading my biography and the description of my contributions to the cybersecurity field. David was more subdued, but in a contemplative rather than withdrawn way. When he finally spoke, it was to acknowledge something that had clearly been weighing on him throughout the weekend. I spent so many years worried about your security, about whether you'd be able to support yourself, about whether you were making responsible choices. I never imagined you were building something that would make you more financially secure than I've ever been, or that you were doing work that actually protects other people's security and livelihoods. His words carried the weight of genuine humility and recognition of how completely he'd misunderstood both my capabilities and my choices. It wasn't just an apology for specific criticisms or dismissive comments. It was acknowledgement of a fundamental misreading of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd ever had about expectations, disappointment, and the ways that parental fear could masquerade as disapproval. Elena's perspective was slightly different, but equally revealing.
She talked about her own struggles with understanding success that didn't follow traditional markers or familiar pathways. My achievements in cybersecurity were so far outside her frame of reference that she defaulted to David's skepticism rather than developing her own understanding of what I was building. She expressed regret not just about missing my successes, but about failing to ask the kinds of questions that would have helped her learn about my world and support my goals. The months that followed the gala marked a genuine transformation in our family dynamic. David began sending me articles about cybersecurity developments with his own commentary, asking for my perspective on industry trends and policy developments. His questions demonstrated genuine curiosity rather than skeptical interrogation. And I found myself looking forward to our conversations about technology, business strategy, and the broader implications of digital security for society. Alana took a different but equally meaningful approach to bridging our communication gap. She started attending local community college classes on computer literacy and digital safety, not to become an expert in my field, but to develop enough basic understanding that she could engage with my work in informed ways. Her efforts to meet me halfway, to develop the vocabulary and conceptual framework necessary for meaningful conversation about my career, felt like acts of love and respect that I'd never expected to receive. The real measure of our changed relationship came during my next visit to New Mexico for Christmas. Instead of the careful neutrality that had characterized previous family gatherings, our conversations were rich with genuine interest and engagement. David asked detailed questions about our latest client acquisitions, our expansion plans, and the technical challenges we were working to solve. Elena wanted to know about my employees, about company culture, about the balance between business success and meaningful impact. Most remarkably, David began talking about my achievements to other family members and friends with the same pride he'd once reserved for Jessica's medical career. I overheard him explaining cybersecurity concepts to my uncle, describing the importance of the work Nexus Analytics was doing, and sharing details about the recognition I had received from industry organizations. The man who had once dismissed my career as playing with computers was now actively promoting understanding of why that work mattered. The conversation with Jessica herself was particularly healing. She called me during the Christmas visit, having heard from our parents about the company I'd built and the recognition I had received. Her response was everything I'd hoped for from family during the early years when I was struggling to establish myself. She expressed genuine amazement at what I accomplished, curiosity about the technical aspects of my work, and regret that we'd grown apart during the years when I had been building something extraordinary. Our talk revealed that she'd also been carrying burdens related to family expectations and comparative success. While I'd been building Nexus Analytics, she'd been struggling through residency, questioning whether medicine was truly her calling or simply the path of least resistance to parental approval. Her admission that she'd sometimes envied my courage to leave medical school and pursue my own vision created a new foundation for understanding between us. The transformation wasn't complete or without setbacks. Decades of established communication patterns don't disappear overnight, and there were still moments when David's instinct to offer unsolicited advice or Elena's tendency to worry about unconventional choices would surface. But these instances became opportunities for gentle course correction rather than relationship-ending conflicts. Chances to practice new ways of relating based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. 1 year after the gala, I received news that would test our rebuilt family dynamic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Microsoft had approached Nexus Analytics with an acquisition offer that would make me financially independent beyond anything I had previously imagined. The decision was complex, involving considerations about company culture, employee welfare, growth opportunities, and personal goals that went far beyond simple financial calculations. For the first time in my adult life, I called my parents to seek their perspective on a major life decision. Not because I needed their approval or permission, but because I valued their input and wanted to include them in processing such a significant potential change. The conversation was remarkable for its depth, nuance, and respect for my autonomy while still providing the emotional support and practical wisdom that family relationships can offer at their best. David's response demonstrated how completely his understanding of my situation had evolved. Instead of immediately offering opinions or recommendations, he asked thoughtful questions about my long-term goals, my satisfaction with independent entrepreneurship versus corporate structure, and my assessment of the acquisition's impact on employees and clients. His questions helped me clarify my own thinking without pressuring me toward any particular decision. Elena's perspective was equally valuable, focusing on personal fulfillment, work-life balance, and the emotional implications of selling something I'd built from nothing. Her questions weren't technical or financial, but they addressed aspects of the decision that were equally important for long-term happiness and satisfaction. She helped me consider how the change might affect my sense of purpose and identity, factors that wouldn't show up in financial projections, but could significantly impact my future well-being. The decision process took several months, during which my parents provided ongoing support and perspective without ever attempting to influence the outcome inappropriately. Their ability to offer wisdom while respecting my autonomy represented a complete reversal of the dynamic that had characterized our relationship during my earlier career decisions. They'd learned to trust my judgment and support my choices even when those choices led into territory they couldn't fully understand. Ultimately, I decided to accept Microsoft's acquisition offer, but with conditions that would preserve Nexus Analytics' independent culture and ensure continued employment and advancement opportunities for our team. The financial terms were indeed extraordinary, but the decision was based primarily on the potential for greater impact and the resources to tackle larger, more complex cybersecurity challenges that could benefit society at a scale beyond what our independent company could achieve.
The day the acquisition was announced, David called within an hour of the press release. His voice was filled with a pride and excitement that I never heard directed toward my achievements before. He'd clearly been following the news closely, understood the significance of the deal, and wanted to celebrate with me in ways that acknowledged both the business success and the personal vindication it represented. His enthusiasm felt like a gift, the kind of parental celebration I'd imagined but never experienced during the earlier years of building my company. Elena's reaction was characteristically focused on the personal rather than financial aspects of the change. She wanted to know how I felt about transitioning from entrepreneur to corporate executive, whether I was excited or nervous about the new challenges, and how the change might affect my daily life and long-term satisfaction. Her questions came from genuine care about my happiness and fulfillment, demonstrating her evolution from someone who worried about my unconventional choices to someone who supported my continued growth and development. The acquisition process provided additional opportunities to include my parents in my professional world in ways that would have been impossible under our previous family dynamic. I invited them to attend the signing ceremony in Seattle, where they met Microsoft executives, other acquired founders, and industry analysts covering the deal. Their comfort level in these high-level business environments had grown considerably since the awards gala, and they engaged with confidence and appropriate curiosity about the strategic implications of the acquisition. Perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the post-signing celebration, when Satya Nadella, Microsoft's CEO, approached my parents specifically to acknowledge my daughter's contributions to cybersecurity innovation. His comments weren't perfunctory pleasantries, but detailed recognition of specific technical achievements and strategic insights that had influenced Microsoft's own security development. Watching my parents receive this acknowledgement from one of the most respected leaders in technology felt like completing a circle that had been broken for far too many years. The months following the acquisition brought new challenges and opportunities that tested the strength of our rebuilt relationship. Integration into Microsoft's structure required adapting to corporate culture, managing larger teams, and operating at a scale that multiplied both the potential impact and the complexity of every decision.
My parents became genuine sources of support during this transition, offering perspective and encouragement without attempting to provide advice about situations they didn't understand. Their support proved particularly valuable during the inevitable difficulties that accompany major corporate integrations. When conflicts arose between Nexus Analytics' culture and Microsoft's established processes, when key employees considered leaving for startups that offered more autonomous environments, when the technical challenges of scaling our solutions to enterprise-level implementations pushed our capabilities to their limits, my parents provided emotional stability and perspective that helped me navigate these challenges more effectively. The transformation of our relationship had profound implications beyond our immediate family dynamic. Elena began volunteering with a local nonprofit that provided technology literacy training to seniors, using her newfound understanding of digital security to help protect vulnerable community members from online fraud and identity theft. Her work connected her to my professional world in ways that gave her both purpose and deeper appreciation for the societal importance of cybersecurity. David's evolution was equally remarkable. He'd started following cybersecurity policy developments at both state and federal levels, writing letters to elected officials about the importance of infrastructure protection and digital privacy rights. His insurance background gave him unique insights into risk management and regulatory compliance that he brought to bear on policy questions affecting my industry. He'd become not just a supporter of my work, but an advocate for the broader cybersecurity mission. 2 years after that life-changing phone call, I found myself in New Mexico for David's 60th birthday celebration. The gathering included extended family, longtime friends, and community members who had known our family for decades. The contrast between this celebration and previous family events was striking in ways that went far beyond my changed circumstances. David's introduction of me to guests who hadn't seen me in years was filled with detailed descriptions of my work, specific examples of impact and recognition, and genuine pride that radiated from every interaction. He'd clearly prepared for these conversations, researching current cybersecurity issues so he could explain why my work mattered and engage meaningfully with questions from curious guests. The man who had once struggled to find anything positive to say about my career had become its most enthusiastic champion. Elena's transformation was equally visible in her interactions with other parents at the celebration. She spoke knowledgeably about technology careers, defended non-traditional professional paths, and shared insights about supporting children whose ambitions fell outside parental expertise or comfort zones. Her evolution from someone who worried about my unconventional choices to someone who advocated for other parents to trust and support their children's diverse aspirations represented a complete reversal of perspective. The evening's most powerful moment came during David's 60th birthday toast, when he deviated from the expected remarks about gratitude and friendship to address our family's journey over the previous 2 years. He spoke publicly about his mistakes in understanding my career, his regret about years of failed support, and his amazement at what I'd accomplished despite, rather than because of, his parental guidance. His words weren't performative or self-serving, but genuine acknowledgement of growth and commitment to continued improvement. More importantly, he talked about lessons learned about trust, respect, and the importance of supporting loved ones even when their choices led into unfamiliar territory. His comments resonated with other parents in attendance who recognized their own struggles with children whose paths challenged traditional expectations. The conversation his honesty sparked continued long after the formal celebration ended, creating connections and insights that benefited multiple families dealing with similar dynamics. As I reflected on the journey from that devastating 2 a.m. phone call to this celebration of mutual understanding and respect, I realized that the transformation hadn't been just about revealing my hidden success. It had been about all of us learning to see each other more clearly, to communicate more honestly, and to build relationships based on who we actually were, rather than who we expected each other to be. The scared young woman who had left medical school 6 years earlier, who had built a company while hiding from her father's disapproval, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned that authentic relationships required the courage to be fully known, even at the risk of judgment or rejection. The parents who had spent decades worrying about their daughter's unconventional choices had evolved into allies and advocates who celebrated her achievements and supported her continued growth and development. Looking forward, I knew our relationship would continue evolving as all healthy relationships do. There would be new challenges, different stages of life, and probably occasional setbacks in communication or understanding. But we'd established a foundation of mutual respect, genuine curiosity about each other's worlds, and commitment to supporting each other's growth that would sustain us through whatever changes lay ahead. The phone that had delivered such devastating judgment 2 years ago now carried messages of pride, support, and genuine interest in my work and well-being. David's calls came with questions about industry developments, congratulations on company milestones, and offers of perspective on challenges I was facing. Elena's messages included articles she had found about cybersecurity, photos from her volunteer work with seniors, and updates on her own learning journey in technology literacy. Most importantly, I'd learned that hiding success to avoid potential criticism was ultimately more damaging than risking disapproval by living authentically. The years I'd spent protecting myself from my father's judgment had robbed us all of opportunities for connection, celebration, and mutual growth. The courage to reveal my true circumstances had created space for genuine relationship based on reality rather than assumptions and fear. The woman who answered that 2 a.m. call had been hiding in the shadows of her own success, afraid to shine too brightly for fear of judgment. The woman driving home from her father's birthday party was someone who had learned to stand fully in her own light, surrounded by family who had finally learned to celebrate rather than diminish her achievements. The transformation was complete, but the journey of authentic relationship was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.